Hello everyone and welcome. My name is Eric Coleman with IIST and I'll be the moderator for today's webinar. Help Me, I'm Drowning in 2-Week Sprints. Please tell me what not to test by Mary Thorn. We're excited you're able to join us today and set aside an hour to attend this webinar. This webinar is sponsored by IIST, the leaders in education-based certifications and training. For more information on how IIST can help you or your organization, please visit testinginstitute.com. This webinar is one of a series of free webinars offered by IIST. Be sure to join us for the next webinar in the series, Effective Requirement Management for Project and Team Success using Ramana ALM, on August 10th from 11 a.m. to 12 p.m. Central Standard Time. To learn more about this and other webinars in the series, go to ramanasoftware.com. You may submit your questions at any time by using your question box in your GoToWebinar window. Today's presenter will answer as many questions within the time allowed at the end of today's session. This webinar is being recorded and will be made available for viewing within 48 hours at testinginstitute.com. At the end of today's webinar, you'll be asked to complete a short survey. At IIST, we strive to provide the highest quality educational resources for the public and would appreciate it if you could take a few minutes to complete this short survey. I will now turn the webinar over to today's presenter, Mary Thorn. Mary?
Thanks, Eric. Thanks, guys, for joining us today. I have a pretty good crowd on the phone. A little bit about me. Bob Galen and I wrote a book called 3 Pillars of Agile Quality and Testing, and one of the pillars talks specifically about risk-based testing. And from that, we have a lot of good techniques that we can teach you in that book, so hopefully you can download it and view it at the end of the webinar. So with that said, we've got a lot to cover. Let's go ahead and get started. We have an agenda for what we're going to cover, some words of wisdom, and then the actual techniques themselves. And you know what? Let's not even go there and just start jumping in. So words of wisdom. What I'm about to teach are risk mitigation techniques. They're not prevention techniques. Okay, test automation, I have found, has been the best risk prevention technique, but it often takes time for the people on the Scrum teams to learn test automation. So I've done a lot with Agile transformations. I probably have 8 or 9 under my belt, and one of the things that I have seen is that when definition of done comes out, it includes test automation. Well, a lot of the teams don't have the skill sets to be able to do that from day one of sprinting. And so what I'm saying here is, what I'm about to go through in this webinar are a few techniques that you can do while you get the test automation roadmap, the strategy defined, the test actually started being created and ran in your environment. That is more of a safety net than the techniques I'm about to give you. But the techniques I'm giving you should help you cover until you get your automation to a point that can be your safety net. So again, these are mitigation techniques, so you should have less defects, and you should be able to handle your testing in a 2-week sprint. But if you really want a safety net, your safety net is your test automation. Okay, the second word of wisdom is, when I rolled all these techniques out that you're about to see, I train the entire Scrum team. I don't train just the testers. Now, I might train the testers first, make sure they understand concepts and how to do the techniques, but then I, as a test leader or the test lead on the team, will teach the entire Scrum team these techniques. So at the end of the day, who owns quality on a Scrum team? The whole team does. And so the whole team needs to know how to get the tasks done, how to get definition done, and the techniques that we will use as a team to get those things done. The third word of wisdom that I will say is, there's 2 issues usually when teams don't actually, can't figure out what to test or get their testing done in a 2-week sprint. One is either the test design, which we're going to talk about, or the other thing that is happening is Scrummerfall or Waggle, you might have heard, where we're basically doing mini waterfalls within a sprint, where the developers will hand the testers off work halfway through the sprint, and then they really only have 5 days to test that work and the work that they get on the last day of the sprint. So we will hit Scrummerfall a lot at the end. The question for you on the webinar is, which one of these is the real problem? And so if it ends up being Scrummerfall, I do give a couple of techniques of how to avoid that in the future. But we're going to handle more of the test design and risk-based testing techniques associated. Lastly, and the one thing I ask of the testers or the team members on the line is, these techniques should allow you to test smarter, not test harder. And when I say that, and what I mean is I've seen a lot of testers enable the bad behavior at the end of the sprint where the developers give you all the work and you work overtime, you work weekends, you work, all the time the last 2 weeks. I've even had some testers say, well, the first 5 days of the sprint, I'm going to work 20 hours because I know the last week of the sprint, I'm going to have to work 60 hours. That's not the goal. The goal is to work sustainable pace and to be able to work 40 hours first week, 40 hours the second week. So what I'm pleading for you guys is to take these techniques that I'm about to show you, use them to test smarter and not test harder. Okay. So our first technique is the three amigos. Some of you guys have heard the concept of three amigos and use it mostly for user story writing. So the three amigos are typically a developer, a tester, and a product owner, and it's a tool to enable conversation. The most common use case for three amigos is used when you go to backlog. You have a hard time at backlog refinement because the stories aren't well enough, aren't really ready to take to the team, and the team spends a lot of time asking a lot of questions. So George Dinwiddie created this technique to say, you know what, before we actually go into backlog refinement, let's have a developer, tester, and product owner have a conversation, ask what if, and so that the story is better fleshed out before it gets to backlog refinement. Now, I take this technique a step forward. As a tester, I realized early on that I am not the smartest person in the room, that it really does take the view of the developer and the view of the product owner to come up with the best test ideas, test designs. And so the techniques that I'm showing you here on thereafter, I include the three amigos in the discussions of these testing techniques. And that, therefore, that's another way to test smarter instead of testing harder. And so we'll get through this, and if you have any questions at the end, we can talk a little bit about it more. My first, so risk-based testing, and that's really what we're talking about. Risk-based testing has been around a long time. When we were in Waterfall, we did this, every release because who actually had to change the way that they tested because the developers would give them things late. So we had all these great risk-based testing techniques that we did in Waterfall because we always were crunched out of time. And with me, for some reason, when I started into the testing world and sprints and Agile, all the testers that I led threw out these testing techniques that we had and just, thought, oh, we're supposed to release after the sprint. We've got to test everything. Well, sorry, you can't do that. That's why we do test automation. That's why we have that safety net. Until you get there, we got to bring those testing techniques that we learned about in the Waterfall world that's been around forever and use those. And at the end of the day, we cannot test everything in the sprint manually, that's for sure. And so when you don't have that safety net, what are some things that we can do? So let's talk about that. The first concept that I'd like to talk about is a concept that was introduced to me about 10 years ago by a guy named Rob Sabrin. Rob's a great resource. Please Google him. He is one of the leaders in what he calls just-in-time testing techniques. And this was the first testing techniques that really hit home for me as a way to do planning. So, in the Waterfall world, we had a test plan. Well, I want a lean test plan. I want a lean test case. What does that look like when we are sprinting? And so test ideas is a technique that Rob Sabrin taught me, and it's actually a really great technique to use within your sprints. The concept of the test ideas is a spreadsheet. And this spreadsheet can be enabled into JIRA or Rally with additional fields. But I just want to make it simple, stupid for you guys to understand the general concept. So I use the test ideas in a couple ways. The first way is, here is from sprint planning, here is everything that we've committed to. And I'm going to go over the spreadsheet with you really quickly so that you understand the concept. So the first column is your identifier. So this would be your JIRA ticket number, your ALM story number, your rally series number. So that's the story identifier. The second column is thinking out of the box. What are all the things that could potentially test for this story? The next one is basically what are your ideas that you need to test for that story? Okay, so the first thing people typically do here is they'll just copy and paste the acceptance criteria and paste it into the test objective as usage scenarios and say, well, I have to test these things. Well, that's obvious, but the goal for me is not only to make sure that we cover the user story from the acceptance criteria, I also want you to think out of the box. We've gotten to the point where people are so worried that the acceptance criteria needs to pass and we have to test that. We don't use our brains anymore and really think about what are all the other things that we should be testing. Oh wow, this actually integrates with the system. I might want to go check that. What happens in this failure mode, because for some reason this failure mode is not actually captured in the acceptance criteria. What's the non-happy path? How does that work? You remember in the waterfall days, we actually had a lot of time to think and test and create really good test cases because we had the time and space to think about the design. Well, in Agile, we don't make the time. And what I'm saying here is here's a technique to take that time and just spend an hour or two after sprint planning and start to really think about what are all the things that I really should test in this. The acceptance criteria, to me, the developer should have that covered. That should work when it gets to you. We really shouldn't have to go and verify that the checkbox works anymore, right? That's just table stakes. But what are all the meaty things that, what happens? We test the acceptance criteria. We don't spend time with our creative thinking and ideas to really think about failure modes. Or you know what? We used to have a bug. We've had a bug in this area in the past. Oh, I should go back and retest this because it seems like every time we touch this, we break that thing again. Really thinking about those things because, we just got to get the acceptance criteria to pass. So I really am trying to challenge you guys and have ideas and come up with a high-level test plan, test outline of what you're going to test. Once you do that, right after sprint planning, you come up with your test outline or your test ideas. I want you to take that Three Amigos conversation and put it in full effect. I want you then to go talk to the business. And as you can see, you have this column of business importance and run those ideas by the product owner. Hey, product owner, here's all the things that I think I need to test for these stories that we've committed to in this sprint. Can you give me your business importance? You know what, is this a high priority thing for you that this works, medium, and low? And so you'll have that conversation. I like that you have it with the developer in the room and talk about what's the priority to the business. And what's interesting in that conversation is, hey, you find out that the thing that you thought was a high-use use case, you find out that the product owner says, no, that's something that's rarely used. This is actually a low importance to me. This is not really an issue. And so they will give it a high, medium, low rating. At that same time, the developer is going to be in the room, and you're going to have that conversation, and he's going to say, you know what, that might be low importance for you. However, when we touch this code, it is spaghetti code. It is technically significantly challenging. And so therefore, this is a significant risk from the technical side. And by the way, you need to also, and what also might come out of that, the product owner and the developer might say, you forgot about, you should test this, you should test this, and you should test this. And you do that for each story. So sometimes you have to bring in different developers, but you do that for all the stories in the sprint. And what ends up happening is at the end of that conversation with the Three Amigos, you get this priority, this 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 priority over here on the right, because the spreadsheet will automatically calculate that for you. The spreadsheet will be given to you guys at the end of the presentation if you would like it. And for me, this is how we test smarter and not harder. If I'm a tester now, I'm going to go write my test cases. I'm going to make sure I cover the 5s and 4s. I might at that point realize that 5s and 4s take all my capacity within my 2-week sprint. All right, so that's what I'm definitely testing. And now I'm going to go back to the team and say, guys, I am not testing the 3s and the 2s. And you're going to get some heartache from that conversation, because the developers are going to say, Mary, look, this is significant risk. I need you to cover this one, even though it's a 3. I need you to really test this because I'm not comfortable. I don't have the unit test coverage that I need to. This is significant. I really need you to do some basic testing for that. And you might say, well, I don't have capacity. Can somebody else on the team pick this task up, this test case up? And vice versa might happen. The business owner, or the product owner might say, Mary, I don't feel comfortable not testing this high importance one, even though it's a minimal technical risk. And you might say, again, I could do that, but I don't have capacity. Can somebody else on the team, since they're 3s, can some of the developers on the team pick up the 3s? And so at that point, it is very transparent. What you have, you and the team has capacity testing from a tester perspective, and what you don't, what you're not going to test. I will tell you, most of the time, the 5s and the 4s will cover 80% of what you need to cover for that sprint. Then you have to take the risk of the 20% to say, the team, the team owns quality, the team's going to cover this risk, or we're just going to make the decision we are not testing these scenarios. My recommendation is you come up with an agreement of how you usually handle the 3s. So maybe you as a team agree we will always test the high business importance, low technical risk, or we'll handle the high technical risk, low business importance, but we can't do both. Okay. Now, 99% of the time, most teams agree we're not going to test the 2s and the 1s. So those scenarios are off the table. We're not looking at them. We're not going to do them. Okay. So I'm going to go into now, so that's kind of the mechanics of it. I just want to go into more of the details around the focus factors, how you come up with the ideas, etc. But that is the general technique. Okay. So what I talked about before is, where do the test ideas come from? I want us to get away from, oh, the acceptance criteria passed, we are good. Well, the acceptance criteria, again, is table stakes to me. I want, where we bring value as testers is at the ability to create from these, use my brain, use my experience, think about the test design. What are the capabilities this thing should do? What are the failure modes? What are the quality or the Italy factors, the security factors, the performance factors, the usage scenarios? This is heavy, what's the business logic here? How does data affect these things? What environment should we test this in? What are past defect taxonomies of bugs that, oh wow, we've had these issues in this area before. I'm going to go back and pull a certain set of bugs that were Step 1, Step 2 that have happened in the past. I'm going to retest those as in my plan because of the fact that we broke this area in the past. My challenge to you as testers is, acceptance criteria should be done by the developers. Use the brain, use your experience, and think outside of that. Back to our good test design in the past, what are other things that we should test that where we get into the real meat and potatoes of the test and test design? So again, just a little more into that. When you're thinking about it, you should ask the question, does the system do what it's supposed to do? Does the system do what it's not supposed to do? How can we break it? What happens in the environment when it reacts to the sort of data? What characteristics must the system have? How has it similarly failed in the past? How have previous projects failed? Finally, using our brains, really being a detective, exploration, and going into these ideas. From a process perspective, just to reiterate, your idea comes into existence, you clarify it with your 3 amigos, you prioritize it, you have a cut line. You know what, and sometimes in that cut line, it is okay for the product owner and the developer to say, that is actually not a very good idea. Let's just kill that idea, even if it's 2 or 1. It just doesn't make sense. And then, from there, understand what we're testing and what we're not testing. That was really this slide. So we call it test triage meeting. You can call it whatever you want to. When do you use test ideas? So when you actually get the ideas done, I like to have them done by the first day of the sprint. So you did your sprint planning. Now you've got your test ideas. I then will come back to the team, say, here's my cut line, and I will kind of use that in the daily stand-up to talk about the risk and what we've covered so far. One interesting thing that comes up a lot of times is when we do test ideas and we do it as part of sprint planning, I have actually seen the product owner change priority of the stories because of the risk factor that comes up from the testing. So it's a good outcome that sometimes comes out of this exercise. Now, one other thing that I like to do, if possible, and while it somewhat falls out of the Scrum process and not exactly how the Scrum guide, it's not a part of the Scrum guide, to be clear, but I often would like to get the test ideas done before sprint planning. So hopefully your product owner knows the top 5 or 10 stories priority, the team, your velocity, so you can kind of gauge what the test ideas, what stories need to have test ideas. The reason why I say that is if you can get the test ideas 70 to 80% done before sprint planning, therefore you kind of understand from sprint planning how much capacity you need based on risk of the story. That point in sprint planning, you can talk about where the cut line is, and therefore we can dedicate developer capacity to the remaining lower, maybe 3, the level 3 ideas to be able to cover when you're out of capacity. However, if you're not that mature, if you can't get them done before sprint planning, again, the goal is to have them done at sprint plan, right after sprint planning, first day, second day of the sprint, so that you kind of know the priority of where you're going to test once you start getting stuff sent to you. The other 2 ways that I've used this technique is when you have multiple Scrum teams working on the same product. When multiple teams work on the same product, one of the things that I have found is I have found Scrum team testers duplicating and triplicating testing across Scrum teams, especially if they're working in the same area. So what I will do is I will have the testers take the epics that may be crossing multiple Scrum teams, work together to create the areas and break down epic down to risk-based areas and ideas, and from there base it on risk, and then assign the areas to the team that the stories are going to go to. So therefore, we're not duplicating and triplicating testing between the teams. And so using the test ideas template as a way to do that. And then lastly, I love, if you have a hardening period or regression period, let's say you have a cadence where you do 3 or 4 2-week sprints, and then because your automation isn't where you need it to be, you'll have a 2-week hardening or regression sprint before release. I love to take and use the test ideas template to put all the component or regression test cases that you're going to have to do in that 2 weeks, prioritize them based on risk, and then, try to get the 5s and 4s done, but have a cut line to say, hey guys, we can't get all the regression done. We're going to test smarter. We're going to test the 5s and the 4s, but we're not testing 3, 2, 1 before we go live. Everybody okay with that? So again, we're testing harder, we're not testing smarter. We're understanding what we're not testing in a regression perspective, and therefore being able to get the work out when we need it to, or the release out when you need it to. Okay, so expanding again on the test case analysis, I often find when I come into Scrum teams that they don't know how to, they don't know a couple things. They don't know what tests they have automated. They don't know what test gaps they have. And so I basically took the test case gap analysis spreadsheet, the test idea spreadsheet, and expanded it as a technique to understand where your debt is, where your test case debt is, where your automation debt is, where your test case debt is, and a way to prioritize that so that when you go into regression or when you go into trying to get technical debt stories created for your automation, you are prioritizing the highest risk items first. So if you look at the spreadsheet, it's broken out in functional areas. And then we actually say, what's the current state of our test case for this functional area? Do we have for our manual test cases, do we feel good that we have partial coverage or full coverage for manual test cases? For automation, do we have partial coverage, no coverage, or full coverage? So we understand from a current state, do we have coverage in manual or automated areas? Then from a future state, does this area need to be automated? Because some areas don't. So again, not everything has to be tested, not everything has to be automated. In that, it creates a column E and S in the spreadsheet that says, is there a manual test that exists? Yes or no. Is there an automated test case gap in this exists? Yes or no. From there, what do we do? And so again, take that test ideas spreadsheet concept. I'm going to, in Three Amigos concept, I'm going to pull the product owner and the developer in the room and say, all right, guys, here are functional areas. We have gaps. From a gap area, Mr. Product Owner, from a priority perspective, is this critical, high, medium, low gap? Is it and then from a developer perspective, is this a critical, high, medium, low gap? And from a developer perspective, they might say, you know what, this is a critical gap, but we have 80% unit test coverage in this area. So this, to me, from a severity perspective, is low. You know, they might say we have 0 unit test coverage. It's spaghetti code, and this is critical, right? So again, it's a conversation between the three amigos prioritizing the risk level. And what the outcome of that is, it will give you a manual test case gap ranking. It will give you an automated test automation gap ranking. Okay, and that gap ranking, 1 is critical. So it means the 1 is, I don't have any, this is a high-risk area. We have no manual test cases, and we have no automation test case for it. All right, so then you say, what do we do with that information? For me, if I'm in regression and that area has been, created, that goes into my regression plan. That is high risk. That's priority number 1 to test. From an automation perspective, I then go to the product owner and say, product owner, we need to write test cases. We need a story for this high-risk area. We really need to get this covered. We touch this area a lot. We have no coverage. We need to write manual test cases. Please give us points or capacity or velocity in the next sprint to create our manual test cases. By the way, once those manual test cases are created, I want you then to create a story for the automation of those manual test cases. So what this does is it gives you the ability to go back to the business and say, in our application, we have risks in area from a manual and automation in these areas. If we were to automate these areas, our risks mitigated, and we go from a 2-week regression cycle to a 2-day regression cycle. So from a business perspective, I can quantify that I'm going to save the company money by investing in covering this debt. So when you write the stories, we really want you to write it in a way that the business understands as a product. I want to automate this critical area so that I get back a 3 days of development and testing because the area has a safety net. So you're quantifying what the business gets back by conquering this critical technical debt. Now what I say is, I usually do the criticals and the highs, and I would make a cut line and not do the medium and low areas, because at that point the high and medium are done, the critical and high are done. And if you're automating as part of definition of done as you move forward new stories, what I find is the medium and low areas get covered as part of that. So I will only put the critical and high risk functional areas into stories to get covered for technical debt. The next testing technique that I like to discuss is the Pareto principle. Okay, Pareto principle basically says that 80% of consequences stem from 20% of the causes. This is the 80-20 rule. Okay, I live and die by the 80-20 rule. People say that, Mary, you're very you take a lot of risks, and that's because I take calculated risks based on the 80-20 rule, because I understand that I cannot test everything. So the Pareto principle thinking is that 20% of the application code produces 80% of the defects. Or you can think of it as 20% of the developers produce 80% of the defects. Or 20% of the test cases or ideas find 80% of the defects, like we talked before. Or 20% of the test cases or ideas take 80% of your time to design a test. And then this is really the critical one. 20% of the product will only be used by 80% of the customers. And so one of the things that I often ask when I come into a transformation into Scrum teams is, do you actually know the usage of how your application is being used by the customers? Because if we know that, from a risk-based testing technique and what I'm not going to test, I'm only going to test the 20% of the product that 80% of the testers use. I'm going to use that information to prioritize my test ideas or use that as a testing technique. A lot of times, one of the things that challenges I run is we don't have that idea. We don't have the usage analytics of our products. And so again, I'll create a technical debt story in the backlog for a product owner to understand that we need this data. We need to understand the 20% of our product that 80% of our customers use, because that's where we're going to focus our testing on. When it comes down to what we're not going to test, we're not going to test 80% of the product that they don't use. And we need to be able to have that data to make that calculated risk. Once you, so from the 80-20 rule, the other thing is defects tend to cluster. So the Pareto rule says that 20% of the defects, I think I'm saying this wrong, 80% of the defects happen in 20% of the components. And so one of the things to prove that we will do is I will actually create component areas in my defect tracking system and partition it out into, say, 5 to 15 different component areas. And so what that does is it allows me to start to track to figure out where the defects are clustering, where are the risky parts of the application, where do 80% of the defects happen, so what's that 20%? And so the step one is to create that in your application tracking system so that when you find these defects, you categorize it in those categories. The second thing that we do is once it's started to track, we actually, for every defect, we go back into the system and we will go back into the system and align them to the new defect categories that we have created, okay? And then the third thing is, now let's look at that data. A lot of times we collect the data, but we never actually observe it and make adjustments. And so when I say observe it and make adjustments, I will go in there and automatically come up with a pie chart to say where's that 20% of 80% of the defects. So in reality, 80% of that defect come from this one component area, and that one component area is let's just say the API functionality. Okay, so I know now from a risk that anytime that we touch the API area, that's my biggest risk. So we know we create lots of bugs there. I'm going to make sure I might do full regression or 100% testing on that one component because it is buggy. But if I then find out that, in this other area that's in my release that we rarely have defects in it and there's changes to it, I might do zero testing there. So that's what I'm not going to test based on the fact that, that 80% of the defects are coming from this one area that we touch. So from there, now that I know from the categorize where most of the risk for defect creation happens, the next thing I do is go in and ask the developers, do you have unit test coverage in this functional area? 9 times out of 10, they don't. 9 times out of 10, that's probably why we have so many bugs in that area. What I will do is I'll go in and have the team create a story to start to create unit tests and automation in this area that most of the bugs are starting to occur on. So that would be a technical debt story. Hey, product owner, by the way, 80% of our bugs are coming from the API. We need a story in the backlog. If we do that, we could reduce our defects by potentially 80%. right? That can be your use case of why this technical debt needs to be refactored, or this automation needs to happen. I also said, let's go fix the bugs. When that happens, what, we might not add unit testing. We might group all those 80% of bugs into one user story, and the user story might be to fix this bug. 8 times out of 10, when they go and look at the code where all those bugs live, the code is a mess. And so the story ends up a lot of times being refactoring that code because it creates bugs. And so we have to have the data to be able to use this technique. And so what I'm saying is do the data in your ALM or JIRA tool, create the categorize, align your defects to the categorize, review that data, and then test the high-risk areas and refactor those areas to reduce the amount of bugs you get in those areas. Okay, so then at the end of the day, your risk goes down. In the long term, it's less testing, things that you will not test in the future, because now you've focused on fixing the quality in that area. Again, though, one of the other things is you have to implement usage analytics in your applications to understand where the customers are using the 20% that your customers are using the application. The next technique is all pairs. So I come from a heavy financial technology background for the past 10 years. One of the biggest problems that I have is around data and combinations of data and testing the right combinations of data. A lot of times there's a lot of business-led applications and a lot of this banking software. The business logic is where we need to focus and test smarter, not test harder. A lot of times when we have all these combinations and permutations of 10 or 12 different variables, we as testers feel like we have to test every different combination before we can release to production. Well, this is a technique to reduce that and help you to test smarter and be able to reduce the amount of combinations that you test as you move forward in your business logic. Okay, so it's called pairwise testing. It is a test design technique that delivers, it says 100% test coverage, but it delivers a design technique that can give you that if you need it. All pairs is sometimes referred to as pairwise or orthogonal arrays or combinatorial methods. You can Google it. It's a lot of big words. It's not a scary subject. Okay? And so again, the goal of this technique is to identify the pairs of variables that need to be tested to achieve a reasonable coverage. Again, the 80-20 rule. Okay? So let me give you an example of how this works. Okay? I'll use the browser environment, i.e. server OS combination, where we always wonder, God, we can't test on all these browsers. How do we figure this out? Now, this is this is one way of variables to test. I actually love to use it more when I have business logic in my application that has 6 or 7 different variables to help with combinations. But this is the easiest way to explain it. Okay. In this grid is all the different combinations of variables for each browser server OSs. Okay. As a tester, that to me in the past, especially in Waterfall, meant I had 224 test cases that I would have to create to make sure that I covered each combination. All right, that is a lot. Test 224, right? First, I would actually go to my usage analytics and say, go to Google and see, okay, Google, data. What is most used OS browser and server? And I'm probably going to whittle a list and say I'm not going to test on 87 anymore. But let's just say this is our scenario. So all pairs, what all pairs does is says, okay, 224, that's not right. We're going to put it in a tool, and I'm going to tell you the tools that you can do and have. But actually, what we're going to say is, based on our all pairs tool, we're going to put this data into it. And what it actually will do is it will take the list, and actually it will take the algorithm, and it will come up with 28 test cases that cover the 224 absolute scenarios that we thought we had to test. Okay? And so that 28 is all we really need to care about. So the intent or the hope is that by running 1 to 20% of your test cases, you'll find 70 to 80% of your defects. All right. All pairs really does help with that coverage. It basically highlights the important tests that you missed, but actually gives you the algorithm, the tooling, and the judgment to understand that you did get the right ones. Okay. You won't find all the defects using this, but it gives you a high level confidence of that. And it gives you a baseline of where you want to start from. So from a perspective of what this gives you, it gives you, the opportunity to find all the variables, to understand what the variables are. Okay, what it doesn't give you is the exploration, right? It doesn't give you every test case that you should do. And a lot of times it misses out on the performance and other non-functional requirements. So, but it's a really good technique for variable combination to take you down to a limited set numbers of things that you need to test from a good algorithm perspective. Now let me talk about when it fails. It fails when you don't have the right values in the tool or the right inputs of the variables. So if you don't know all the different variables, this will give you the wrong data, right? The other thing about this is sometimes the combinations that come out of it actually are non-realistic combinations. So what I often will do, let's take the example before when we went down to 28 tests. I will put those 28 combinations in my test ideas document. I will then go over those 28 test ideas that came out of the tool with the product owner and the developer and give it a risk assessment, because even those 28 might be too high. That might be more capacity than I can do in that 2-week sprint. We will put a risk assessment of 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 based on the combination. And a lot of times what I've seen is when we take the output from this tool, that some of these combinations actually in real world would never happen. So we would just kill that idea or that output, and it would go from 28 test cases and scenarios that you would have to do to say 14. And then those 14, from once you put into the test ideas template, would be prioritized. And then from there, you would have a cut line to say, okay, we still have 14, scenarios that we need to test on that are valid, but you know what? We don't have time to test all these different browsers, OSs, and stuff. So we might only test the 5, which is the top 3, and we're not going to test in these other ones based on the test ideas template. So again, these build upon each other, testing techniques that I'm giving you on what not to test. And here are in this presentation a list of the tools. My 2 favorites from a free, really easy command line prompt type executable is picked. There's a link to that, and Hexawise. Hexawise is a really good interactive tool that's online. It does a lot. They actually partner with a lot of financial technology tech companies, but that's 2 of my favorite to use. Okay, I've got 5 minutes to talk about what I call, so those techniques are really helping you cut the line, what I'm not going to test. I'm going to test smarter, I'm not going to test harder, be transparent on what I'm not going to test in a 2-week sprint. Hopefully that helps you until you get your automation into a place where once you have your automation, when you covered your high-risk areas and your critical areas from an automation perspective, you have that safety net. That definition of done from here on out is that you're automating. You can start to lessen these risk-based testing techniques. I've had teams throw them eventually away, but then I've had teams just keep them because they actually found a lot of value out of them. Now, if what I have taught you today that you do not think is going to solve your problem, that those techniques helping you not what to test is not going to solve your problem, then what your problem really is what I call Scrummerfall, which is many waterfalls in a sprint, or Wagile, which is waterfall and agile. Then the techniques I'm going to introduce in the next 5 minutes, and there's several deep dives. We can talk more about that later. You can Google it. You can work with IIST on training classes. But these are techniques to prevent what I call Scrummerfall or Wagile. So I said there's 5 techniques that help prevent that. I'm going to clarify what I mean by Scrummerfall just in case people on the phone don't understand. The first one is what Scrummerfall is. Scrummerfall to me is you have a 2-week sprint. Let's say you have 5 developers on your team and 2 testers. What will happen is that first day of the sprint, 5 developers will pick up 5 stories because, they want their own story. They don't want to share it. Then they work 5 days because a lot of times those first 5 high priority stories are pretty big because they don't know how to break them down yet. And they will actually hand it off to the testers on day 5 of a 10-day sprint. So now the testers, when they did their capacity planning, they thought they had 10 days to test the stories. Now they only have 5 to test the stories that they get on that day. And then the testers start testing those 2 testers start testing those 5 stories. Then the developers pick up 5 more sprints, and they deliver those stories on the last day of the sprint. So now 10 stories have, the testers have 2 testers have 10 stories to test in 5 days. And really, they don't have that much because they get stories delivered on the last day. This is where I'm telling the testers, don't work the weekends, don't work overtime, because you are enabling the bad behavior for them to continue to do mini waterfalls in that sprint cycle. So there are 5 ways that I have solved this problem, and here are the 5. Again, I can talk to your Scrum Master, go to training through IST, but I'm going to give you high level how to solve this problem. One is sprint planning. Did you plan it that way? When you're in sprint planning, you should ask the question to your developers, and when you look at the sprint plan at the end, when's the first day I'm going to actually get something to test? Now, I want the testers to be testing early, testing in the dev environment, pair testing with them so that we don't have this behavior, but at the same time, when am I going to get it to test? 9 times out of 10, if you actually step back and look at when I'm going to get it to test and then when it's going to be completed, you will see that you actually planned that waterfall behavior in that sprint. So a technique that I would do is just put the 10 days on a wall and then just put the story, start a story when the tester's going to get it and put it on the wall when it's going to be done. And then just have a high-level view of when that story can get done. You will actually see that your bottom 2 or 3 stories aren't going to get done because of when it's going to fall being delivered to test and when it's going to be completed. So just take a step back, look at the overall plan, map out start and end dates, and see how you're find a way to prevent and have a better flow of that work so the Scrummerfall doesn't happen. The second thing is the stories being too big. Are they vertically sliced? A lot of times people will put in a 13-point story in a 2-week sprint. I can tell you from my experience, 13-point stories rarely fit in a 2-week sprint. Break that up. Break that up into 5s and 3s, or break that up into 1s, 2, 3s, and 5s. And what we find is that if we can break the stories up into 5s and 3s, and they're vertically sliced, meaning there's parts of the UI, parts of the services layer, part of the database, all in one story, you can have multiple developers working on one story instead of having one person to one story. Because we really want as many developers on the top priority story as possible, and the second priority to the point we don't having more developers working on it. So smaller stories, vertically sliced, so that you're doing all the parts of end to end of that story, so that can be delivered to provide value at the end of the sprint. The third one is a lot of times the team members on the team don't have the skills to pick up certain tasks. Maybe the developers don't know how to do the test automation. Maybe they don't know the skill set. They don't know where the test automation framework lives. They don't know where the test cases are. They don't know how to create the test automation. Maybe the testers don't know how to write database scripts, and they need to. So I often take an assessment of the skills on my team, figure out what level they are. Are they junior, mid, high? And then find out what they don't have any skills in, and start doing knowledge transfer sessions, KT sessions, pair programming tests. Have a developer partner with the automation guy so that he knows how to create the test. Fourth, when the developers hate, is code free. But let's stop creating new code on the 9th day of the sprint. So all the stories need to be to test by the 9th day of the 10-day. That gives us a day to finish testing, gives us a day to fix bugs. Don't pick up anything new unless it can get done by the end of that sprint. So put a code freeze, no new tests into that. And the last one, and this is a silver bullet, and people say there's no silver bullet in Agile, is create work in process limits. So what I mean by that is you can only have 3 stories in progress at a time. If you have 3 stories in progress, that means they're probably vertically sliced, they're probably smaller, you have multi-skilled people, and that's what way, instead of having 5 developers have 5 stories in progress, you have 3 stories in progress with 5 developers and 2 testers on them. You can have as many tasks as you want in progress, but we don't want you to have more than 3 stories. That allows the flow, to be better, and therefore until you can't pick up a 4th or 5th story until one of the top 3 are done. Okay, that is a silver bullet to stop that waterfall behavior. Often teams don't know how to create vertically sized stories. Teams aren't multi-skilled, and that prohibits them to do that. But if you do that, have these smaller vertically sized stories, multi-story team, you can have very easily multiple people on the story, which then will help that waterfall behavior in that sprint. So that's it. Those are some techniques to help you test what not to test and to prevent Scrummerfall. Hopefully that answers some of the questions of why you attended today. Eric, back to you.
Wonderful. We do have a few questions, Mary, if you want to go ahead and take a look at that. Otherwise, I can read those to you.
For some reason, my pane is very small. So can you start with the first one, because the question is really small in my pane right now.
Sure. What is the scope of test planning in Agile?
I use test ideas as my test plan. So I take all the stories, I scope them all out and test ideas, and so from having a big test plan anymore, that goes away. I literally will use the test idea spreadsheet. You might say, Mary, that doesn't work in a regulatory environment. I have done it at banks. They accept it as long as you teach them how that works. So, you know, if it's regulated, you can make it as lean as possible, and that's what we're trying to do here.
Okay, our next one is rigorous unit testing useful in Agile? Useful to lower the burden on UI tests and promote exploratory testing?
Absolutely. There's what's called the pyramid, Agile Testing Pyramid by Mike Cohn. What it says is the base of most of our test automation should be at the unit test level. 50 to 60% of our automation should be at our unit test level. 30 to 40 should be at the integration level. Only about 10% should be at the UI. So our tests really need to be at that lower level, fast feedback, less brittle area of unit test. Then you supplement the exploratory testing on top of that as a technique to be able to use our brains to find the things that we don't think about.
Okay. This also might follow up with that, but how much testing is enough? QA engineers typically do not want to own the risk and not executing all the test cases.
Again, I use these techniques to say what is enough and be transparent about where the cut line is of what I am testing. So I'm very transparent. Team, this is what I am testing. This is what I'm not testing. Here's the cut line. And what questions do you have or concerns about that plan? And if you don't like the plan, let's come up with a plan as a team together to figure out how we get there.
Okay, next one is, how do you suggest automated testers communicate with manual testers?
So I often think it's hand in hand. I don't want the testers to really, so first of all, we have to create the test cases that the automation people are automating. I I would love if we have a handoff. So I do a lot with behavior-driven development, but I would like our automation people to be able actually to write good test cases. So the interaction is that the manual testers are teaching the automation people how to write good test cases. They might have a deal together that the manual tester writes the test cases and the automation automates it. They might have deals where they write them together and the manual person starts to learn the automation skill set. And so then they are fungible to do both skill sets. But at the end of the day, heavy collaboration between the two, and then heavy collaboration with the whole team because at the end of the day, the whole team owns the quality and meeting the definition of done. So the whole team needs to know how to do the automation. So not just the manual tester you need to interact with, but the developers as well.
All right. Next one is how QA engineers approach testing if development team uses TDD approach?
TDD is great, and so TDD helps make the software testable. And so for testers, that's great because you will have test harnesses, things like that to allow you to test earlier. And so from an interaction perspective, I would be pairing with the developer during TDD so that you know what he's testing. You're giving him advice on what test to create, and therefore when you get to do your testing, you're not duplicating your tests anymore. One of the biggest challenges that we have with manual and automation testing is that we duplicate and triplicate testing. And so if you partner and pair with the developer while they're doing TDD, you already know what they've covered from a unit test perspective and what they're testing exactly and what's left that you need to test, which again is another way to say, hey, this is what you tested, this is what I'm testing, and this is what I'm not going to test.
Okay, and then also like a follow-up to that one, how can QA engineers make sure all the acceptance testing is done via unit test cases by the developers, and how do you decide who would test what with the developers and QA engineers?
Yeah, I mean, so great question, same follow-up. If we're doing TDD and unit testing, I love for the testers to actually partner and be a three amigo with the developers while they're doing their unit testing, reviewing their test cases, making sure that they're covering the happy path, the not so happy path, making sure that they're testing for some scale, not with just one record, maybe with 500 records in their scenario or for performance. So it really is just a heavy collaboration where we're working in parallel and partnership with that developer. As a tester, I'm testing in that dev environment with that developer while they're doing the unit testing. I'm exploring with them so that 80% of my testing is done, and then when therefore they checked it in, moved it to the integration environment, I go and I sign off on the integration environment, but I only have 20% of my testing left because I know what their unit tests cover, I know what they've created integration tests that they've covered, and I might finish my UI testing in that integration automation in that integration environment.
All right, the next one here is what are some agile testing practices you can use in a data warehousing project?
Data warehousing to me is no different than any other. I actually use the pairwise technique, the kubatorial testing heavily in data warehousing techniques, and also unit testing and TDD because it's heavy data. And so, really understanding what for testing, really understanding the logic, understanding what's being stored, understanding what we are pushing the data through. I have several stories of automation and data warehousing from a previous bank I worked with where we were having to load terabytes of data and push it into the data warehouse and the SLAs around that. But we were heavy in unit testing in that. We're heavy in the integration and contract testing between the services and the warehouse itself.
All right, and then looks like we have time for one more. Is one tester enough for an agile project? Running the automated regression test cases against dev environment is more useful, or should it run in a QUA environment?
So I like the test automation to run in all environments, to be honest with you. It has to be done in QA, UAT, internal environments. I'm torn on the production versus not, but I like the developers to, before they check in code, if we have integration and UI or unit integration UI, I a lot of times like them to run the automated tests, all the automated tests, not just unit, against their code before they check it into the dev environment or into that integration environment. So when it goes into trunk, usually. So I really like it to run on dev, in the test environment and UAT. The developers usually though running just the pieces that affect the code that they are doing, and then all of it, in the integration and UAT environment or staging, whatever we call it.
Okay, wonderful. Well, that is all the time we have today for questions. Do you have any last final remarks, Mary?
Yeah, so for me, wrapping it up, there's a lot of different techniques, that we can do to de-risk what you're not testing. Me and Bob Galen wrote a book called The Three Pillars of Agile Quality and Testing. You can get it on Amazon, and it really talks about the framework of a lot of the stuff that we talked about today and how to go about testing harder and not testing, or testing smarter and not testing harder. So feel free to go grab you a copy. And also, I work at Mary Thorn Consulting. You can reach out to me either via marythorn.com or marythornconsulting.com. And the great thing about IST is they have a ton of these testing techniques and stuff online with them and courses that you can take. So feel free to sign up for some of their courses as well. Eric?
Wonderful. Thank you, Mary, for your time today, and I want to thank everyone for joining us for today's webinar sponsored by IIST, the Leaders in Education-Based Certifications and Training. For more information on how IIST can help you or your organization, please visit testinginstitute.com. Again, be sure to join us for the next webinar in the series, Effective Requirement Management for Project and Team Success using Romana ALM, on August 10th from 11 a.m. to 12 p.m. Central Standard Time. To learn more about this and other webinars in the series, go to testinginstitute.com. You can follow IIST on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, and YouTube to find out more information about IIST news, events, and promotions. Thank you all again for joining us today, and have a great day. Thanks again, Mary.
Thank you.